Greetings, Langonauts, one of our favorite Lango demonyms. And speaking of amazing Langonyms, Peter had a really good one that we got to share with you.
Okay, what do you call it when a student at Lango is studying multiple languages at the same time?
I don't know. What do you call
Langols.
it? Nice.
Oh, nice.
Okay, so today's episode is called What Even is a Syllable? And that raises the question of the syllable, what even is it? So the syllable is a rhythmic unit in human speech, right? It's a useful concept for learning other languages. And of course, it's useful to language science as well, which is where we draw it from. So maybe you've learned about the syllable in school. I don't know. Sometimes in America, it's taught with clapping. You clap the syllable. But there are different rhythmic systems in the world, and not all of them employ the syllable. English, I would say, uses a syllable. There is another system called the Mora, which is used by languages such as Japanese. And there are other proposed systems as well, such as stress-timed and things like that. But for the sake of this podcast, we're going to focus on the syllable. And even though it may not be the most accurate theoretical analysis for every language, it's useful for the language learner to learn pretty much any language. So that's why we're focusing on the syllable. Tyler has kind of a heuristic to think about when you're trying to think about syllables.
Oh, yeah, more on Mora about that later.
Ah!
Tyler and a cat, love it.
Yeah. This cat is wise.
For those that don't know, Tyler is a cat lover. That's unrelated to linguistics, perhaps.
How many cats do you have right now?
So it hovers around 3.
3.
Yeah.
You've tripled your amount of cats in your place.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we have a slide up about, it has a cat, in case you're listening and not watching. It is a cat with his mouth very wide open. And the quote is a quote from Tyler. It says, "A mouthful of language." Tyler, do you want to explain that for us?
So my thinking is we're probably all familiar with the basic division in speech sounds between consonants and vowels. And vowels are mouth open-y sounds, while consonants are mouth closey sounds. And the syllable is made of grouping those together with the vowel in the center. And if you count the number of times you open your mouth while saying a word, onomatopoeia, you can count the number of syllables.
Nice. So in case you aren't watching, the cat has a little bubble saying syllables as a series of opening and closings. And you see the cat's mouth is very wide open. It's hilarious, trust me. Believe me, folks, it's hilarious. Okay, so it's helpful to view rhythmic units, syllable or not, as a landing spot for stress. Now I'm introducing this new term, stress. We've sort of talked about it in other podcasts, but we need to expand a little bit more about it in this podcast since we're talking about syllables. So when we talk about stress, one thing you might want to look for is an acoustic correlate. What is an acoustic correlate? That means if I say a syllable is stressed in English, what acoustic properties does it have that I could say put this speech into a spectrogram and measure the spectrogram and know without listening, but just through looking at the spectrogram, which syllables are stressed, right? And you can know the syllables on a spectrogram very easily by the hint Tyler gave in the last slide. So vowels are extremely easy to spot in a spectrogram. They have formants and stuff. It's the open mouth part.
We should do that. We should look at that one of these podcasts. Really interesting.
We need to have a future podcast where we do a little bit of spectrogram reading so people could see how they could measure their own speech and learn things about other people's speech. So when we look at stress, we're going to use English as our example, but it's pretty much universally true. There's actually not any one-to-one acoustic correlate for stress. Not just in English, but there's what makes stress in English, the acoustic correlates, aren't the same as what it is in other languages. Right?
Maybe we should
There-
talk quickly about what they are in English. So there's loudness for one, and aspiration.
Right. So there's this paper in 1958 by Fry, and Fry tests the things that Tyler's talking about, calling them, instead of loudness, he calls it amplitude, right? So Fry tests for length, amplitude, pitch, intensity, etc. And Fry kind of concludes there's no one-to-one correlate. And Fry and follow-up work over the past 50, 60 years has kind of concluded that in English, maybe pitch is the best acoustic correlate for it. But a combination of things like length, amplitude, pitch, and intensity kind of make up the what is it of stress, right? So as a useful heuristic, we can compare some words in English which, under a certain view, only differ by stress. The first example is produce and produce. Now, this is a noun-verb shift in English. We do it with several words. I do not think these are native English words. These are words borrowed in from Latin sources, French. Because I see it a lot in Portuguese between past tense and present tense. We're going to talk about that later. So if you are a native speaker of English, you may perceive that the only difference between produce and produce is stress. Maybe you've never thought about it. You should think about it now, though, because we're talking about it.
You should think about it now.
But this is very useful for language learners.
That's right.
Yeah,
Particularly if
because
you're learning English, it's going to be useful. But if you're a native speaker of English learning another language, learning about it in English will help you learn about it in other languages and help you recognize it. Stress is so subconsciously assigned and interpreted that it's actually one of the least intuitive topics in all of linguistics. People struggle, I know that I did, particularly at the beginning of my linguistics career, struggled to perceive stress accurately even in my native language, right? But after you get used to it, you become a whiz at it.
Take it for granted, though.
Yeah.
So it's useful to point out, I think, that in English, maybe not every word, but every phrase that you utter is going to have at least one stressed syllable in it.
I agree.
I would like to quibble with
primary spot.
I'd like to quibble with one of the things you said just now, Peter. You said you may see the only difference is in the stress. The vowel qualities actually differ between produce, in all these word pairs.
I agree. That's actually why I said you may, if you're a native speaker. If you're a linguist, you'll say, well, there's an alternation between an O and a schwa. That's right. An alternation between produce and produce. Right.
Versus pro, right.
But
this is often not taught too in English classes in terms of pronunciation. Explicitly.
I was not taught it even as a native speaker of English. I never realized there was two words until I was a linguist.
Absolutely.
Right. What I want to say about Tyler's point is there are analysis. It's a possible analysis of English that actually, like Lisa was saying, we were all talking at once, but she mentioned that it could just be that the difference between produce and produce is not a difference between pro and pra, that's the result of stress. So when stress is on the O, it's pronounced as a full O. And when an O in the underlying form under this analysis is unstressed, as in produce, then it reduces to schwa. We actually talked about this a little bit on the day we talked about schwa and the Great Schwa Conspiracy. Is it a real thing or not? But I think if you're just learning, if you're a native speaker of English, it's probably easier to think about it as stress. If you're a second language speaker, it's extremely important to know the difference in vowel qualities too. Yes. And it may be the result of stress, it may not be. That's, of course, a matter of analysis. I actually tend to agree with Tyler's analysis on this one. But just for the sake of learning, these are our examples of words that differ by stress. Our next example is content and content. And again, it seems like an A, ka, and content is reducing to schwa, content, when it's unstressed. But it's a little bit more similar than produce and produce, which is why I included that.
And just to clarify, by A, you mean the vowel quality ah, right? I think
the vowel quality ah, that's correct.
Confusing listeners otherwise. content. That's the vowel in con, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Content versus content. In content, it sounds like the ah sound has been reduced to a schwa.
It's
To me.
not there, yeah.
Yeah. So while we're talking about a syllable, I thought I would introduce the anatomy of a syllable. What are the parts? Right. So the front of a syllable, if we're viewing it as left to right, remember in previous podcasts, linguists always view things as left to right. The mouth is pointed left to right, etc. So the front, meaning not the middle at this point, we'll explain further. That's usually where the consonants go, is called the onset, right? The onset is the beginning of things, and it's the beginning of a syllable. The middle of a syllable is called the nucleus, right? Which is a scientific term for stuff in the middle of a system, right? So like
It's a kernel. Kernel, not the military rank, colonel.
I didn't know which one you were going for. I was like, At first I
The
thought,
kernel.
Okay, so the end of a syllable, we're talking about as a linear thing, it happens in time, is called the coda. Right?
Which means tail.
I did not know that. That makes sense, though. It's the tail of the syllable. So typically, the onset and coda, if it's populated, it will be filled with consonants, and the nucleus will typically be a vowel. So we represent these kind of things inside syllables as C for consonants and V for vowels. So if I were to write down capital C, capital V, capital C, other linguists would know that that is a sequence of consonant, vowel, and then consonant. We will call that a closed syllable, right? So now that you have a basic understanding of the syllable, we're going to go on to Syllable Anatomy 102. This is slightly more advanced than Syllable Anatomy 101. All right, so in our CVC closed syllable, we have it structured here. We have formalized it, if you are looking. It looks like a triangle, sort of. At the top, there is the word syllable, and this represents the whole syllable, often represented with a sigma in linguistics. And there are 3 lines coming from it. The first line goes to K, which is our onset in the word cat, because we had that syllable cat earlier. So now our syllable is cat. And you might think cat starts with a C, but that is in the orthographic form, which we have represented there with angled brackets. And the beginning is a K, even though it's spelled with a C. We call that the onset. And one line from our dominating node, the syllable itself, the highest level, goes straight to the onset. That's K in cat. Another line goes to the middle, to nucleus. And the nucleus of cat is A. We call that vowel an ash in linguistics. Is that what y'all call it?
Sometimes.
That's what I call it.
Yeah.
What
Ash.
else do you call it?
Pronunciation student at the moment refers to it as the flower-shaped vowel.
Oh, my pronunciation students say AE.
The flower-shaped vowel? I like that.
Does it look like a flower? Yeah, I can see it. Looks
Yeah, I
like
can see
a
it.
4-leaf clover.
Mhm.
Hat tip to bow. English
Nice.
will.
All right, so the third line goes to T, which is our coda. So these 3 form a constituency, which we call the syllable. Constituency means like a unit that acts together or moves together. Our shared teacher, Hadge Ross, has a saying, OCM, only chunks move. And it's a constituency test for syntax, but it works for this too, right? These are a chunk. It's a thing that sticks together. Okay, now you are very seasoned anatomy of syllable students. So we're going to move on to the second part of Syllable Anatomy 102, which is much longer than Syllable Anatomy 101. So now we're talking about a constituency within a constituency. So that's a group within a group. Tyler mentioned earlier that any phrase in English will have some sort of stress or a tonic or something, a tone. So a phrase could be something like a green dog. Like you could say, Bill pets a green dog. And a green dog is its own constituency syntactically. Likewise, due to the dual structure of language, meaning it's fractal, it's refract. This is one of the recursive properties of language, not the one Chomsky's typically referring to, but there's always constituents within constituents. It's true with the syllable too. Here we have the same word, cat, K-T, and we are proposing to you this new constituency between the nucleus and the coda. We call that the rhyme, R-I-M-E. Right? I know that you can spell it the same way as rhyming as in words that sound the same, but I was introduced to this spelling, and I think that's maybe the more conventional spelling.
When
Also
talking
used
about
for-
syllables.
Yeah.
Yes, when talking about syllables, but it is also generally the part of the word that people try to rhyme with in English, right? So A and T form a constituency. On this particular slide, I can't give you evidence for this constituency, but I promise to pay later. I will show you evidence for it.
You want to talk about spoonerisms?
Why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Okay, so spoonerism is named after a figure in the 19th century. He was a reverend, and he did it without meaning to. He would say things like, instead of "our dear old queen," he would switch the onsets of syllables. "Our queer old dean," the Reverend Spooner. So it's named after him. And what that shows is that the K in a word like cat is liable to move. It's not, right. So the rhyme sticks together in those cases, while it's the onset alone, whether simple or complex onset, like in queer and so on. The onset will travel, the rhyme will stay in place.
That's right. So a spoonerism of my name, Peter Schulke, would be Sheeter Bulky. I never said it out loud. Now that I heard it, it doesn't sound as good as I thought it was going to. But
Cheater bulky. I like it. You're
that's my
henceforth
spooner's name.
Cheater.
Right. So I guess this is another example of evidence for the constituency of nucleus and coda as they stick together in English. Right. So it might be sort of worth mentioning a little bit in the cutting edge modern phonology, there is evidence that the onset and the nucleus act as a constituent in some languages, but it's a much more rare phenomena. So I think that for now we'll focus on this way. And if you want to know more about the constituency of onset and nucleus, send us a message. My email's on the end of every single podcast. You can reach out to me and we'll talk about it. All right, so moving on to our next slide of Syllable Anatomy 102, we're going to talk about light versus heavy. So a light syllable is one which has only a nucleus in the rhyme, right? So no coda in a light syllable. So particularly no consonant coda, but no coda, so no sort of glide or diphthong or whatever. Some languages treat it differently. We'll talk about that more in a second. For now, I'll give you a few examples of light syllables. The word for the indefinite article in English, normally pronounced so like I have a green dog. Is a light syllable because it only has a nucleus. Also, the dative preposition in English, to, as in I went to the park, only has an onset and a nucleus. So that's a light syllable. Now, we inherited a word from the Vikings for a fun wintertime activity called skiing. Now, ski, be it the verb or the noun, is a light syllable, even though it has two things in the onset, because in English and most languages, what makes the difference between light and heavy syllables is what's in the coda. So now we're going to give a few examples of heavy syllables as well. And as a reminder, a heavy syllable has a nucleus plus a coda or length. Right? So vowel length could make a otherwise light syllable as a heavy syllable. So in some languages, these things, as mentioned in previous slides, tend to differ quite a bit between languages. You could say each language has their own personality and they treat things differently. And within every language, there's tons of variation. And these are the other flavors of the personality as well. Some examples of heavy syllable include our favorite example for today, which is cat, because it has a T at the end, although in my native English, it has a glottal stop at the end. But for the sake of these Langarinos, I will pronounce it with a T. Another example of a heavy syllable may be a different pronunciation of two, right? So particularly the two in, that means also. The two as in, I like green dogs too. And that's a little bit longer than I like to swim, right? So maybe we would find some phenomena that would indicate that one, two, one, two, one, two is a heavy syllable, but another two is not, right? So we have this written here in square brackets that say T-U-W for the long two, as in I like dogs too, and a T in schwa as in I like to swim. So these might be different. We might even look for some phenomena which hinges on these, right? But that's a topic for another day because it gets pretty complicated. I want to now give you a brief survey of syllables. Particularly, we're looking at syllable shapes. What can a syllable look like? Now, the most simple, and we're going to use all English examples with a minor commentary on what happens in other languages. So our first syllable is just a vowel by itself. Now, it is universally allowed with a hedge, right? Meaning it's not 100% universally allowed, but generally if you are learning a new language, you should expect that they allow some words to just be a vowel. That some syllables, at least, are just a vowel and have nothing else in them. And Tyler, you mentioned this isn't necessarily universally true. Would you like to discuss your counterexample? I believe you said...
Not
For
really.
Chinese,
Yeah, that's what I remember.
glottal
Well,
stop.
Right there, it seems if you have a syllable that is spelled with just a vowel, like hungry, in the onset position, you will likely have a glottal stop sound. That's made by briefly closing the vocal folds, the uh-oh sound in English. So some phonologies require some kind of consonant in an onset, and if there's nothing else specified, it'll be that glottal stop.
Is that true in a phrase?
That's a good question. I would need to do a bit more research to answer that.
Because in dictionary form, meaning this in linguistics means if you say one word in isolation, in most speakers of most languages, when they're saying one word in isolation, if the word begins with a vowel, it will have phonetically a glottal stop at the beginning, because when you're not breathing, of course, you close your glottis. So if you're preparing to speak and loading up that subglottal pressure, usually the glottis is closed and people will naturally put a glottal stop at the beginning of a vowel in isolation, even though it's not necessarily in the so-called underlying form. So
That's
this
a
is
good
a
point.
question. This is a question for Chinese for us. Is it the case that if you have this word hungry in a sentence, do you begin it with a glottal stop?
We'll have to look
Anyhow.
at some spectrograms and
Yes,
figure
I
that one
think
out.
even if it's not true for Chinese, I have heard of this phenomena in other languages as well, but it's fairly rare. Most languages that you encounter will allow a vowel by itself to stand as a syllable. For example, Portuguese does with their definite articles, o and a. So you can say, o menino, the boy, a menina, the girl, right? And the o and the a are standing by themselves. The next syllable shape that we have is CV. That stands for consonant vowel again. And this is also, as far as I know, universally allowed for real. I don't know of any language, I've never heard of one that doesn't allow this sort of shape. And you can imagine why this is not only universally allowed, but the most common syllable shape cross-linguistically. There are languages which only allow this shape. As far as I know, Hawaiian language only allows this shape, and it's very common in the Oceanic language family. The only branch of Oceanic, just as a note, that typically allows codas, and even lots of them, is the Micronesian groups, because they underwent stress shift and then reduction, right? But that's a story for another day. So anyways, our example in English is go. Now, in English, go kind of ends with an off glide, a labial.
Uh,
Wah, that's right. So if you spoke a language like Portuguese or Spanish, they may allow you to really say rounded vowels without a gloff glide. So the second person singular in Spanish is tú.
Mhm.
I hope that pronunciation's okay. Anyways, there's no off glide at the end, even if my unaspirated T wasn't perfect.
The Japanese word for five, go. It's just,
Well,
there's nothing coming after that O vowel.
perfect example. Our next work, we're going to call it a common syllable shape, is VC. So that's vowel consonant. And in English, this is exemplified by the word of, full of pizza. Right. So where did that sentence come from? So of only has a vowel and a consonant. Now, this is actually not as common cross-linguistically as you might think. There are many languages which do not allow codas. So an example I have here is Hawaiian language. In a prominent theory of phonology, and phonology is kind of the study of the mental side of speech sounds, so it's not phonetics. In a prominent theory of phonology called optimality theory, they propose a constraint called no coda, right? Which means that the language doesn't allow codas. And under optimality theory, every language in the world has a constraint against codas, but they have other constraints which rank differently, and then other constraints may outrank no coda and allow codas in the language, such as English. But you can see why proposing such a constraint is useful for language science, because you notice this pattern that many languages don't allow codas, and that in many languages, there's restrictions on codas that aren't restricted on onsets. There seems to be a lot more restrictions on the coda, if it's available, cross-linguistically than onsets. So you can see the motivation for this. And as a language learner, you don't have to learn anything about optimality theory, but the idea that codas are where the restrictions are going to be might be useful as you jump into learning new languages. So for example, Tyler, I think you were mentioning they allow codas in Chinese as well, right?
If we're talking about Mandarin, yeah, there's 4 or 5 coda sounds that you can get after a vowel.
But only those 4 or 5, right? And you can't just put anything in the coda.
That's right.
Right?
There's a
Is
large
that true
set
for
of
Korean
consonants,
as well?
in terms of restrictions on this, yes.
Only a
Yeah.
couple things.
Yeah, only a couple things.
So if you are studying Korean at Lango, and you should be, then one thing you may have noticed is that there are 3 types of stops
Mhm.
in Korean. There is unaspirated, aspirated, and tense. Is that correct?
Mhm. Plain or lax, aspirated, and tense is how the students learn it. And yeah, that's very useful. And certain sounds can't be in the coda.
Right. Only one type of stop can be in the coda. Right. If you want to know, sign up for Korean lessons. So I'm joking. It's very Googleable. It's very easy to know. It's the least marked of them is the one that's allowed.
Yep.
So this concept is useful for language learners, whether or not you are a practitioner of theoretical phonology. Okay, so the next syllable in our survey is CVC, the one we've been celebrating all podcasts so far. Our example here is the word is the word rock, right? Now you might be thinking, hey, rock has 2 letters in what should be its coda, CK, R-O-C-K in English, but the sounds are just R-A-K. That's a closed syllable with 3 sounds.
Right. If you just close your eyes and say the word aloud, listen to how many sounds follow the vowel rather than using your eyes.
That's right. Probably every podcast we're going to have to repeat one of our central tenets, which is writing is different than sounds. Okay, the next syllable is one we've discussed a little bit. That is CCV, such as ski. And this also becomes less common cross-linguistically. There are many languages which love to have an onset, but only one thing, right? So there's some constraint against complex onsets. Of course, if you think complex onsets are bad, you should think complex codas are worse. if you're a language, if you were one.
Does Hawaiian have any onset clusters?
As far as I know, Hawaiian does not allow onset clusters. Most oceanic languages do not. Right? It's a rare circumstance that they do. Of course, this is phonological clusters. Languages like Roviana allow an apparent phonetic cluster because all voice stops are pre-nasalized.
Uh-huh.
So a word like fish, which might be written Habu, and is phonologically just 4 sounds, is phonetically hambu. I think that's the word for fish. Just recalling off the top of my head without a dictionary. It's a word. They have many words, of course. Sasa is another one. Okay, so what we see is there is restrictions on what can be in the onset or coda, and usually one thing's allowed in the onset in most languages. I mean, it must be. There's no language that just has vowels. That we know of.
That we know of.
That we know of. It would be cool to find a language which had, say, 35 phonemic vowels and no consonants. It would be very hard for us limited vowel speakers to understand.
If you were a conlanger, it'd be a really cool one to construct that had only vowels, no consonants.
Yes, conlang is short for constructed language, and that is what you see in things like Game of Thrones with Dothraki, and if you're a Star Trek fan with Kling. This is also why, if you're a linguist, you'll notice that the pronunciation between Khaleesi and the other people she speaks to are wildly different because it's not a natural language, so there is no native pronunciation.
Give her a break. She had to learn it.
Calling David Peterson to create a new conlang.
If you really
Only
want to
vowels.
torture the actors, make it a language that only allows vowels as syllables, and it has 45 phonemic vowels, and
They need a lot of training.
I think only consonants would be even crueler.
only consonants. Well, there are some languages that are close, right? But that's a little bit, you're unlikely to learn a major world language that allows stops as nucleus. All right, so I believe we are on VCC, where you have a complex coda but no onset. And this is, of course, pretty rare, but totally permissible in English. It's illegal, not illegal. It's legal. It's good. We like it. And an example of this is arm, as in the thing between your shoulders and your hands. So that is ARM. It's spelled that way, and that is a phonemic representation in English, which I'm pretty happy about. There's not so many. The next one is CCVC, and we've also picked one that's orthography matches its phonemic representation, and that is the word star. You may know this word in another language like Spanish or Portuguese, and notice they don't say star, right? So in Portuguese, it's estrela. Seems to me that that STR is very conspicuously similar. I'm guessing those words are related.
You would be correct.
But there's a limit on what you can put in the onset in Portuguese, so they actually put a vowel before the S, right? Moving on. Our next word is also a word from historical linguistics. It's called drift. If you want to know more about that, please contact Lango. One of the most interesting phenomena in the world, very parallel to convergent evolution. It's convergent sound change. And drift has 2 things in the onset, D and R, and 2 things in the coda, F and T. That's a CCVCC syllable. That's pretty complex. Few languages in the world allow this much of a tough syllable.
Take pride, English speakers.
Yes, we should make a harder word for pride even, like prisds or something. Okay, our next word is strong, and that's CCCVC, right? Now, this is not the most complex syllable in English. When I say complex syllable, I'm referring to a syllable that has a lot of stuff in the onset and nucleus. What is the most complex syllable in a language will be the one that has the most things in both onset and coda. Right, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later.
Starting to spoonerism there.
It was a real spoonerism because it was purely accidental.
Oda.
Just like in homage to Spooner himself.
Mm-hmm.
So today we're actually going to move on to comparatively speaking much quicker than normal but that's because we want to talk about the syllable phenomena across languages. We're going to talk about the H in English, and that segment's called What the H, and it's exploring restrictions on the English H. We're going to talk a little bit about if haiku poems from Japanese are actually translatable in English, because what happens with light and heavy syllables in Japanese. And then we're going to do a little bit tiny more about phonological theory with weight to stress principle, probably my favorite thing in phonology at this point. And we're going to look at weight to stress principle, also called WSP. We're going to look at WSP in Hawaiian and Portuguese, right? So starting off, we're going to look at stress and syllable restrictions in English under the title, What the H? What the H? As a small note, did you guys ever notice that there are Englishes which use the sound H in their name for the
Yes.
word H? I was shocked when I arrived in Australia and people said H, but it makes a lot of sense. It should have the sound of the letter in it. So anyways, moving on.
If we apply that principle to W, what does that get us? W?
I wobble you.
It has W in the end. The W is at the end of W.
Good eye. And the letter Y also at the end.
That's
They're
right.
at the end of the alphabet together there too.
Oh, this is a new project and a new challenge. Next podcast, look for a wild challenge having to do with alphabet sounds. Okay, so I'm just going to spoil it with H and tell you H is banned from the coda in English, right? In fact, if you are a native speaker of English, you may struggle to learn to pronounce and perceive the H in coda of other languages that you want to learn. Two major world languages that I know of use H in the syllable, and that is Indonesian and Portuguese. They both allow H in the syllable, and it's actually pretty common. And if you aren't used to looking for it, you might not even hear it. So
And
an
just
example,
point out we're talking about the sound H, not just the letter H. We have words in English that end in H, but we mean the sound here.
that's right.
Letters are not sounds.
We have words that are spelled with H, like huh, meh, but I'm pronouncing it with an H there to be silly. But
Ba.
notice this. That's right. O and ah, these don't actually have an H at the end. They're just spelled that way. A word from Portuguese that does have H's in it is spelled Dormir. And in the dialect of Portuguese that I speak, the Carioca dialect of Rio de Janeiro, R's in those positions in codas are pronounced as H, but the orthographic R is pronounced as an H. May even be an H in the phonemic representation. Story for another day. The Portuguese word to sleep sounds like this, dormir. I don't know if you can hear that over the mic, but it might be because you're a native speaker of English. The mic might be working fine, right? So H in onsets is okay in English, right? Because it's not allowed in the coda. Well, sorta. So H as onset of stress syllable. Our second point on stress and syllable restrictions regarding H in English is that H kind of can only be in certain onsets. This is where stress starts coming back in. So you get a word like VEHICLE. And, how do y'all pronounce that word?
Vehicle for me.
Same, vehicle.
Vehicle.
Same for me. So it's vehicle in my 3 syllables. Actually, it is spelled with an H, but I don't pronounce it with an H. But there is a potentially acceptable pronunciation, which is vehicle, right? Now, the difference between vehicle and vehicle is not just the H. When English speakers want to say vehicle, they have to put secondary or perhaps even primary stress on the syllable with the I sound so that the H can appear. This might lend some insight into the pronunciation difference between vehicle and vehicular. So vehicular is, of course, adjectival form. And when you add in that extra sound at the end, vehicular, When you add in that extra unit, it shifts the stress so that it's still in line with its right spot in the end of the word. We can talk about sound pattern of English another day. But it basically allows that. So a similar kind of alternation between electric and electricity. Now that's called velar softening. It's a different phenomena, but you notice that the stress shift causes some things, right? And the same with vehicle and vehicular, right? Also note the alternation between the vowels, right? So when you say
Sorry, which vowels? Okay.
in vehicle and vehicle, you don't say, you say which I have as a schwa, and then
I do too.
So the stress one might argue that the schwa is a reduction of this vowel in the unstressed form again. So the schwa conspiracy never ends in English. The best evidence that schwa reals is subpoena, I think. Reals, by the way, in case you're not as hip as me, reals is just a verb form of to be real. It's just a new. So what I mean is that if the schwa is real, subpoena, the word, is great evidence because it ends at the end and it's a verb.
It's the only verb that I've found, or one of a very small number of verbs of which that's true, where the stem ends in a schwa. The thing you're adding suffixes to. Subpoenaing, subpoenas.
It's a rare word.
Another? Please let us know if you do.
Yeah. Are there
I've
any
been
others?
thinking about it. Challenge Lango getters. Just got to figure it out. If
Challenge.
you figure that out, we'll give you the biggest shout out ever. Come up with a second word that ends that way.
You'll be LanGoat.
We're hitting almost all the demonyms today. Okay, I want to do a little more calculus or Mora calculus on light and heavy syllables.
Nice.
So where are all these Mora puns coming from? Well, we mentioned Mora a little bit earlier, that Mora is the word for the unit of stress.
Not stress.
Rhythmic unit.
Timing unit.
Yeah, the rhythmic unit in Japanese. Maybe I've even read analysis in which Japanese doesn't have stress, just pitch and things like that. And I certainly think many words don't have it in the underlying form. There's some very interesting analysis out there, but we're just going to teach you what's useful for learning. And this is something that's worth considering. A one Mora word in Japanese is one which has, if you were using the syllable to measure it, a one Mora word has nothing in the coda, right? But as soon as there's anything in the coda, it's two Mora. You've got to remember the rhythmic unit is different. So we're going to start with the one Mora words, and then this will become clear when you look at the two Mora words. So a one Mora word in Japanese, an example of a one Mora unit would be I have it written here in hiragana.
Yeah, I don't really think this is a word.
Yeah, does this have a meaning on its own?
Let's use the example which means picture.
All right, perfect. Is a word. I just meant that is one Mora, whether it's, I know that people say sometimes like like at the beginning of something. So
that would be a long one though.
Yeah, I think maybe it's not a word, but this one unit written hiragana is certainly only one Mora, right? And it's one vowel. It's useful to know that there is a one vowel word. I did not know that. I think u means tail or something maybe.
Sorry, what language?
Japanese?
I can't remember. U means tail or something. It's maybe Googleable.
Oh. It's a short O sound. Oh.
Oh.
Yeah. We can use that too. So meaning picture is one. Give you the kanji as well.
Oh yeah, I'd heard it. I'd heard it out loud. I hadn't read it. Yes, it's certainly an O. Anyhow, the main point here is that one vowel by itself would count as one Mora, a one vowel unit. Now, if you have a CV unit, such as the word for eye, me, then
Eyes and what you're
eyeball.
you see out of.
Yes, I forget that there's I, me, and eyeball, right? So this is the thing you see with is called me or me. I think me is an English pronunciation. No, I think in Japanese they just do me, and there's no off glide. So this would be CV, and that would count as one mora. So far, that's like our concept of the syllable very much. One vowel, one syllable. One CV unit, one syllable. But this changes once we look at two mora units.
Morae.
Morae is the technical term. It's very hard for me not to say moras.
Because the
I'm
spelling, yeah.
Uh,
AE.
So a
Mori might be a
CVV,
good pronunciation too. Mori.
Mori or Morai?
Mori.
Like if you look at the spelling of Caesar, that one, Caesar. So AE should be pronounced
Mori.
Okay.
Mori.
For those just listening, it's by itself, Mora is spelled Mora, but in the plural, it's Morae. And Tyler is proposing a pronunciation like Mori, and we are endorsing this pronunciation.
I would also propose that it's pronunciation, not pronunciation. It's the same singular plural pattern as in alumna, alumni.
True. Okay, that's useful.
You say alumni?
That's how it.
Oh man, I've been saying that wrong too. Yeah, the
For
spelling
those
is powerful here.
For those listening, my face is expressing extreme skepticism right now. I've definitely been saying alumni my entire life.
I say alumni.
That's the masculine plural, spelled with an I. The feminine plural is spelled with AE, alumni. It's not very often heard. I don't think I've ever spoken aloud, but that would be the official plural of alumna.
You're getting extra bonus material this podcast. Returning to the Mora, a CVV unit would count as two Mora. So we have the word today, kyo, which is CVV. If you are an English speaker and you're a native speaker of English, it may be hard to hear the difference between these two units. A, kyo. B, kyo. I'm exaggerating so you can hear, but we can call it a length difference.
The first one should be shorter, should be kyo. Kyo.
Kyo.
Like the first syllable to say last year, kyonen.
Kyonen. Right. So the point is, though, in English, either kyo or kyo would be one syllable in English.
Right.
And in in languages which are analyzed as having syllables, that was how it works. In a Mora system, though, this length means it's two units, two rhythmic units in Japanese, two morae. Mori, excuse me.
Mori.
So the pronunciation is a beat. You can count a beat along while you're saying Japanese words, and just one beat is one mora, if you like. Kyo, kyo.
Kyo.
Is that 3 beats?
2.
Kyo.
Kyo.
So the vowel gets 2 beats.
Okay. The beat method is I'm new to it. I'm a noob. It's not as helpful for me quite yet. But returning to the Mora again, we have CVC, right? Now this in a syllable would still be one syllable, but this would be two morae, two mori. It's going to be hard to correct that one. I have an example. Of course, I love to constantly connect phenomena between Japanese and Portuguese. If you have not noticed that yet, there's 2 languages I love very much. So I have picked a word in Japanese that is loaned from Portuguese, and that is the word pan, which means bread. Portuguese modern pronunciation is pão. So pan is 2 mori, but it would be 1 syllable. So this brings us a big question about haikus. So I assume it's somewhat common in the US to know what a haiku is and that it has something to do with rhythm. When I was a kid in school, I think several different years we had to write haikus.
Me too.
I think it's a fun
I loved
thing
it.
to do. I still think it's fun. I am not a good haikuist, so I'm not a good haiku poet, but I think they're very clever and I enjoy them. But there is a problem now that we know the difference between rhythmic units in English and Japanese. There is a discrepancy between those 2 units. For example, the word pan is 1 syllable in English and 2 mori in Japanese. Now, if you're trying to make haikus in English, they typically tell you it's this many syllables for this many syllables for this. But if you are using closed syllables, then your syllable count will be wrong for the Japanese morae count.
Same with diphthongs too. We could look at the word haiku itself. To us, it's two
Mm,
syllables, haiku, but in Japanese, it's haiku. 3 beats,
3
3
syllables.
mori.
Haiku, for those
Mm.
listening, is to stretch it out.
Haiku.
It would
Haiku.
be 3. That's a perfect example, Tyler. That's 2 syllables in English. That's going to be 3 mori in Japanese. So the question is, are haiku poems translatable? And I guess you could say, I could know what you mean. I could know the meanings of the words. But some of the beauty of the poem is lost in translation because you can't preserve the rhythmic units. And because of the pressure of Japanese language, these rhythmic units are more important. For example, Japanese has coda restrictions. They only, if they, obviously they don't have a syllable, they have a mori, but if you want to analyze it as a syllable, they only allow the nasal to be in the end, right? Is that right?
Well, in the middle of a word, you have a different thing too. You can have a beat of silence.
Ah, like the geminate sounds.
Right. Those twin consonants.
Ah, like
So perfect example.
That
So
cannot happen word finally, but you get it in the middle of words.
nice.
right, so this really makes us wonder, like, is that, oh, what I was saying is that because they have limited final codas, word final codas, you can't have a geminate at the end. It has to be intervocalic. And because they have a limited number of phonemic vowels compared to a language like English, English has complex codas. Many things are allowed in the coda, and many types of vowels allowed at the end of words. So in English, our poetry tends to focus more on rhyming, right? But rhyming is less important when verbs come at the end of sentences and many verbs end in the same sound. It becomes trivial. Rhythm becomes much more important. And anybody who knows about English poetry knows that rhythm is incredibly important in English poetry too. So Hadj Ross, our shared teacher, may argue that poems are untranslatable from any language to the other because of these subtleties.
That's a good point. And
Yep.
hopefully this makes everyone want to learn Japanese.
I hope so. Gambate. I didn't even make it geminate. I'm the worst. After all that talk. All right, so now we're finally going to introduce a little bit about weight to stress principle. All right, so the weight to stress principle essentially says that stress will be attracted to weight.
And we should
alternate version of this, weight meaning heavy or light.
For our listeners, for the benefit of the listeners, we're talking about W-E-I-G-H-T, weight, not W-A-I.
Wait a minute.
Yep. Weight versus heavy weight. So across languages, there's a conspiracy, a phenomena, which seems to apply to many of them, which is that either stress lands on heavier syllables or heavy syllables are only allowed when they're stressed. That's a matter of analysis. We just call the phenomena weight to stress principle. But it could be the reverse too. It could be stress to weight principle. So length matters in Hawaiian language. Now, I bring this up so that you know that some languages have long vowels. We discussed it a little bit in Japanese, but the Japanese doesn't represent it necessarily orthographically that way. So if you're a student of Japanese, you may think it's a sequence of vowels rather than one long vowel, just by the reading. In Hawaiian, their orthography indicates long vowels with a macron, and that is a straight line above the vowel. It looks kind of like a tone from a tonal language.
Tone mark.
This is a preface, I am not a native speaker of Hawaiian. I am not even a very good student of Hawaiian, but I love the language very much. And while I lived in Hawaii, I studied with some people who are very dedicated scholars. And so I want to relate a little bit about Hawaiian language. But just as a note, if you are a Hawaiian person listening to this podcast and you would like to share Hawaiian language with us, we would love to be
Please come on. Yeah, we'd love to have you.
Love it. So this is my pronunciation as a weak second language student. Do not take this as authority. Okay, the word for person is kanaka, and the word for people is Kanaka. Right. I think stress is still penultimate, right? But I'm just pointing out that there's length. This kanaka is the thing that makes it plural, that makes it people. The same phenomena is seen in the transition between woman and women. And I like this example because it parallels the English example, where the difference is really a difference in vowels, right? So the word for woman, singular, is wahine. And the word for women, plural, is wahine. Again, I'm attempting to stay true to, I just looked this ones up and listened to it on Duolingo right before this. And those, my understanding, are pronounced by native speakers. This is my imitation. So long vowels in these words indicate plurality. It's not totally across the language, but there's a couple instances of it. So is there any way that this interacts with stress? Well, sometimes it does, right? So typically it's penultimate, as in aloha, which means love, but it can be a greeting like hello or goodbye. Lani, which means sky, cognate with Indonesian langit, right? Uku, which begins with a glottal stop, and that means Laos. Uku is an Austronesian word for Laos, which was borrowed into English twice. Once in the word cooties from Indonesian kutu, and then once in the word ukulele from Hawaiian, which means jumping flea.
And note in the spelling form it's indicated.
That's right. They use a symbol that looks like a upside down or backwards apostrophe, and it's called an okina in Hawaiian orthography. All right, and our final example of typical penultimate stress is mahalo, which means thank you. So heavy syllables tend to attract stress, whatever that is. But from what I could hear through listening, not exactly in words like maalama, which is to help. Waikiki. Now, Waikiki is a kind of a good example of exactly what we're talking about. Think about this. So in case you aren't watching, Waikiki, which is written on the screen now, is W-A-I-K long I, K long I. Now, these long vowel distinctions are not represented in English orthography, but you'll know that we absorbed some of it when we borrowed the word into English, because consider how bad it sounds to say Waikiki. Right? Mm-hmm. I had a friend visit me while I was living in Hawaii, and they said, let's go to Waikiki. And I was like, what did you just say to me? I don't know why I thought it was so wrong. And like, obviously it's not that. It's not a second language speaker isn't gonna, know and such. But it indicated to me, wow, we have preserved some of the vowel qualities of Waikiki. Because in English, we say it kind of even stressed, Waikiki, right? They would all act as their own foot unit. Now we have Kanaka and Wahine. And my understanding is the valley where the university is, Manoa, also has a long vowel, but then the stress is on the next thing. But what you should notice, the difference is here, the weight difference, is that you get Wahine, but Mahalo. So the wa attracts, maybe we can call it secondary stress or something, right? So an alternate view is that heavy syllables create their own accent group. That is taken, I got this from Elbert and Pukui's Grammar of Hawaiian, and they got it from Sheets, 1977, Grammar of Fijian. In case I included this because Albert Sheets recently passed away, and he was my mentor at Hawaii. So I wanted to give him a small homage. This sort of thing, an accent group, is often called feet in modern phonology, meaning there's a foot is a rhythmic unit composed of syllables, typically 2 syllables. Somebody just can't wait to learn more about weight stress syllable. So that was a small thing about at least secondary stress is attracted to weight, or at least, even if it's not true in the Hawaiian system, it's perceived that way by speakers of English like us, because the weight stress principle is that universal. So let's look at the next slide. We have weight to stress principle, WSP, as a language learning tool. So this is where the good stuff starts. This is where you can start applying this. Now, I hope you're out there studying Hawaiian. I hope that's what's happening. But some of you won't be. And some of you will be studying Portuguese instead. And this is going to be very helpful in Portuguese because Portuguese does not necessarily, I guess they do represent it in the orthography if you know what to look for.
A little plug for Peter. Peter is teaching Portuguese at Lango. So if you like this method for learning about Portuguese pronunciation, please join our classes here. It's new to Lango.
That's right. We're doing some cutting edge Portuguese language pedagogy. I don't think anybody has ever applied weight to stress principle for language learning in Portuguese. But I can tell you as a language learner of Portuguese, in case you don't know, I am not a native speaker of Portuguese. I am married to a Brazilian, and I've been speaking Portuguese as much as I could every day for 11 years. So I learned Portuguese entirely through speaking. I never, in fact, my background is in Austronesian languages, and so Portuguese was always just a fun language for me, where I refused to learn anything formally because I thought the fun of discovery. And this is one way I learned about stress in Portuguese was weight to stress. And I'll show you, these examples will become clear in a second. So typically, Portuguese has penultimate stress. Penultimate means next to last. Ultimate would be last. So in the word for dog, cachorro, the stress is on the second to last syllable. If it was on the last syllable, it would sound like cachorro. If it was on the first syllable, it would be like cachorro. But it's on the second syllable, cachorro. This sounds good to us. I think universally, a lot of languages like penultimate stress. So probably French speakers not like it as much, but the rest of us, most of us learn penultimate stress pretty easy. I'm sure the French speakers do too when they're learning non-French languages. Another example of penultimate stress is in the word for 5, cinco, which only has 2 syllables, so it's maybe
Say
not
that
as
one more
clear.
time. Say it one more time.
Cinco.
Ah, I hear a different vowel there on that.
That's because there's underlyingly there is an O, but a lot of times the O will raise to a U. This is mid-vowel raising, and it happens with front and back vowels, but that is too much for this podcast. If you really want to know about mid-vowel raising in Portuguese, contact Lango for Portuguese lessons. We'll teach
Yeah,
you
you
the
got to
whole
take
thing.
Portuguese if you want to know.
You want to speak like you're from Rio de Janeiro? You got to sign up at Lango. Okay, so I will teach you this though. How does weight to stress principle interact with tense and agreement? Now, this was pretty confusing for me when I started speaking Portuguese because I didn't know. I didn't see the orthographic forms. I was only listening, and there are some forms where the present tense for first singular, or I mean the present tense for third singular sounds almost exactly like the past tense for third singular, or for first singular. I got those reversed. It'll be clear in a second when I give the examples. So for now, we're going to give the so-called control cases. And this is present tense, where you have penultimate stress in verbs. So an example might be to know, present tense, which would be sabe or sabe in fast speech. If I swim, present tense, that would be nado from nadar. Right? Now I'm giving away the next secret, which is in the infinitive form. In case you don't know what infinitive means, in English that's to. So if you say, I like to swim is the infinitive form. If you said something like, she likes to swim, then it becomes clear that likes is the inflected form, which is non-infinitive. And then to swim, because it is the to there, is the infinitive form. We mark infinitive with a to in English. In Portuguese, that is marked by having an R at the end of the word.
The R that is an H.
The R that is an
Indeed.
H. That's right. So this word, which is spelled like saber, if you were going to pronounce it in English, is saber in Portuguese. Right? I don't know if you could tell the stress was on the final syllable there. So previously I told you she knows, third singular present tense, is sabe. Now present tense, well, no tense, infinitive is saber. So we've got a stress shift from first syllable in sabe to second syllable in saber, right? This is one way you can recognize infinitive forms when people cut the H out in fast speech, right? Because if you say, I like to know, you would say, gosto de saber, right? Now you can see how in fast speech, people might start cutting that H a little bit. It's weak. It's at the end there, right? But you'll always know
Which form
that
it is.
because the stress moves, right? This is like, there's lots of redundancy in language like this that's informative, and you can tell parts that would be confusing because they're redundantly informed. That's an emergentism topic for another day.
But that's a great tip for fast speech, which is a challenge for language learners.
You know, I felt the same way. I studied Japanese for a year, and I did 2 semesters of intensive study, and I went to Japan. I was like, I don't understand anything anybody's saying at all. It was a shock to me because, you know, that was my second language to study, my second language. All right, so I want to tell you about the past tense. So now we've already looked at swim. Present tense, first singular is nado, right? Past tense, first singular is nade. Right? Now the stress is on the second syllable, right? Let's examine a potentially ambiguous example.
Hold on though. What is that macron doing in your underlying representation?
What I am proposing here, if you're looking at the slides we have here, you'll see that I have spelled the past tense first singular for swim in the phonemic representation as N-A-D long E. I'm proposing here, mostly as a matter of making it easy to learn it, that actually this is just a long E. Now the pronunciation, it could be possible that this is actually a sequence of vowels. That could be possible, but it would be impossible to know with the kind of, they have like certain types of, I don't want to call it vowel harmony, but the way, the mix with the vowel raising and the vowel eating, it's hard to, I can't imagine the test you'd have to do to separate if there was actually 2 or it's 1 long vowel. If you're a learner of these, it's much more useful to think of it as 1 long vowel.
Gotcha. Showing length. Okay.
I didn't even know they were spelled as 2 different vowels until I looked it up. Like I just heard it and was like, oh, well, they have a long vowel. If Portuguese was an unwritten language that we were describing for the first time, I think if you came from a language that had this convention, you'd probably represent it this way. But if you're like me and had no background in it, you would just say it's 1 long vowel. So I want to examine an example which is ambiguous. And you can see it's so confusing for me, thrown into Brazil, not really speaking Portuguese, just trying to figure it out. And I would often say things like essentially like when I wanted to say I did something in the past, that the third person did it in the present. And this is why. You get a word like beber, which is to drink, B-E-B-E-R. Now, when they are spelled quite differently in their different inflected forms, but the pronunciation is where it gets tricky. The third singular present version of to drink would be baby. Now it's spelled B-E-B-E, but I told you already sometimes the E raises to I in these contexts, right? Like after the stress vowel. So baby is typical pronunciation for third singular drink present. Now, first singular drink past tense is bebi, right? And that one is spelled B-E-B-I with the real I there. So they aren't treating it as a sequence of long vowels here. Nonetheless, it attracts stress, right? And maybe stress causes it to look longer. Or the alternate view, which might be useful for the learner, is that it's a long vowel and therefore stress moves from the typical penultimate position to the final position. So you can know the difference between baby and bebi, right? Baby is going to be she drinks. Bebi, I drank, right? So this is going to be pretty useful because even where they aren't exactly ambiguous, the way this one is ambiguous except for stress, in my opinion. Even with other words, there'll be a bigger difference between present. This is a particularly hard example, but there are easier examples. But the problem is a lot of the past tense forms the endings are similar to present tense forms, and they're plausible versions of them, except for stress shifts, right? So
very useful.
I think I've beat you guys in the face with Portuguese stress shifts enough. It might be time to look at one of our favorite languages at LanGo.
한국어.
한국어.
And for Korean, the syllable, returning to the syllable, it's a very useful notion for learning the pronunciation. So let's dig into what the syllable structure is. And I'm thinking of my beginner 1 class right now where this has come up so many times for pronunciation. So knowing this structure will really help you. So in Korean, the syllable structure, what's permitted is shown here with our symbols, right? C for consonant, G for optional glide, V vowel, and then C. So in the onset position, you can have 1 optional consonant and then 1 optional glide or semi-vowel.
And
Right?
can you tell us real quick what you mean by glide?
Yep, you can have in this position here, you can have y, you can have palatal y, or you can have w, labial w there.
So
right?
the y is in 안녕, right?
Annyeong has it up here. If you're listening, I have a little speech bubble that says annyeong, and that means hi. Or if you're an Arrested Development fan and always wondered why the Korean kid was called Annyeong, it's because he ran around saying Annyeong. All right, in the coda position, you can have 1 optional consonant as well. And I have a little asterisk there because there is some variation with that. And I'll talk about an example in just a moment. Please remind me. All right, and so that means that the only obligatory element in this syllable is the nucleus vowel. All right, and that's why everything else is shown with parentheses. All right, so let's look at some example words to illustrate all of this. So we can have a syllable with just a vowel, right? An example is the word E, right, which means, Tyler's become very advanced at Korean.
Thank you. There's a
E
few
can
words.
mean,
Well, there's the one that comes to mind is the word this, the pointing word. Or it can mean to, or it can be a verb root to be, the copula.
Yep, it can also be one of the subject marker variants. E.
Postposition.
All right, another shape is an optional consonant in the onset, and I have an example down here. All right, so we have the word him. Do you remember what that means? Him.
Strength.
Strength. And that has the onset h, nucleus e, and then the coda m. So another consonant in the coda. All right, and then my other example here, this is fun to say, is pwep, pwep. And here you have that optional glide here, pwep. As in, pwep겠습니다. Yeah, that's one of the hardest phrases to learn in beginner 1 Korean. Peter, do you remember what that means?
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, 처음 뵙겠습니다. Literally, it's the first time we met. It's nice to meet you. pwep, the formal version of to see or meet.
So I think the wa and this o are representing the same segment, right? That would just be represented the same way in Hangul.
Yeah, yep. It's in 1 syllable block in terms of the writing. Yeah.
It's doing double duty here.
Doing double duty. And then I want to talk about real quick the variation here. In the coda, for the most part, it's only 1 optional consonant, but there is some variation, especially with 1 particular word, to be wide. So it's, Tyler, can you annotate for me and spell that out?
Try to.
It's quite a complicated first syllable.
What's a good place? Here above the Lango logo?
Lango logo where you're down on the bottom right?
We're right there.
I think our faces are right there, but anywhere there's some nice white space. Yeah, maybe bottom right above the logo there.
The logo? Okay.
Right, so we have, it's n, l, b in spelling. Uh-oh, let me move our faces a bit.
Overlapping? Okay.
Yeah.
Let me just clear and let me move it a little bit leftward. I'd like to, again, be a little nitpicky and say that we have lots of words and syllables spelled with complex colors, but we're talking about pronunciation here.
Right, which is another point I'll make at the end because there's rules for writing in Hangul too, right? And I'll show you what happens with the sounds in pronunciation.
So there's the root. Thank you.
Very nice Hangul.
감사합니다.
Good, nice syllable blocks there. Right, so this word in the dictionary form is pronounced nup, 높다, right? Because of the syllable structure, the L sound here is not pronounced. Although there is a little bit of variation for this one, you will hear in some varieties 넓다 with the L sound. You can still kind of hear it there. But for the most part, words like this get pronounced 높다, one consonant sound there in the coda.
It's also a nice English parallel. We have lots of words written with a now silent L, like palm and calm and so on. It's the
Yeah,
same
salmon.
also.
Yeah, that's a great
Same.
example. Nice
Is
parallel.
Korean writing, Hangul, is that unique in that it's the, I know that sometimes what's written in the coda doesn't always go in the coda, but I can't think of
Right.
another writing system which indicates syllable structure this way. So it's kind of nice. You get this thing called the pachim, which is the bottom, which is where
Literally means the base or the foundation, and in this case of the syllable block.
and it would be the coda if it was going to be pronounced.
Exactly,
Now,
yeah.
if you were really into optimality theory, you would just say some things can't be the coda and they bounce over to the onset due to maximal onset principle, which we didn't talk about today.
If you love it.
Most don't.
Most don't.
I do though. So.
All right, here's some examples. So there's a lot of English loanwords that have come into Korean. One of them is exemplified here. So the English word stripe, one syllable in English, stripe, would come in to Korean as a loan word, stripe. It becomes 5 syllables because it to conform to the syllable structure of Korean, this vowel is inserted. Right? It becomes much longer in terms of syllables. stripe. And this is a source of much, I think, amusement. In our first Beginner 1 Korean class, I'll ask everyone to put their English name into Korean, both the spelling and the writing. And many of the students are very amused at how much longer it becomes. Funny story, when I was traveling in Korea for my master's thesis with also our shared professor, Dr. Patricia Sucor Avila, right? She has quite the name. In Korean, it becomes so long. What would it become with these rules? And everyone had such a hard time saying it.
Patarishia.
Yeah, it would become something like paturishia, paturishia, right? So 5 syllables.
Although if you spelled it with an S, you could get the sound pat and then ri.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, there are some other tactics you can paturi. It would still be 5 syllables though. But yeah, you could have that. You could have that strategy there. All right. The Korean example here. So in the Korean word for price is kap. Kap. Okay, so you see it here. The first syllable is quite complicated here, right? So it has 기억, 비업, 시옷. Right? So it's another 4-stacker syllable. And it's pronounced kap with the p sound, but then the b sound here is now pronounced to conform to the syllable structure. Right? Lose it. Yeah, or sorry, the other way. Loses the final shiot there. Kap. Yes.
If you had a following particle, like the topic marker, would you hear the S, kapsun?
Yes, absolutely. You would have, if you have the topic marker, you would hear kapsun, right? So that sound would, like Peter mentioned, it would bounce over, travel over to the next syllable, right, to conform to the syllable structure. You could also have kapshi with the subject marker there, right? So when it appears as a syllable by itself, like here, kap, or when it has a following syllable with a consonant, so if you attach the particle meaning also to, right, it still loses the final s sound. So it'd be kapdo, kapdo. Right, so very useful to know for Korean pronunciation. Now this is a really good NB. It's different from written syllable blocks. So there's different rules for writing syllables. Here are the rules here. So you have to start with an initial consonant in a syllable block, and it can be on the left or the top. And after that, you have to have a vowel on the right or the bottom. Okay, and then there's optional combinations. So a final vowel, consonant, or a combo. So when you have a word, for example, like name, the word for name is i름. I름. If you're listening, that first syllable has this letter here that looks like a circle, the iung, and then it has the vowel e, right? But that circle letter is not pronounced here. It just acts like a placeholder there to conform to the written rules, but it's not pronounced. So this iung has two sound values, right? In the initial part of the syllable block, it's not pronounced. Whoop.
Ready?
All right. So very useful concept. And for more with Korean, take Korean with us at Lango, please.
That's really interesting.
Peter is also starting to learn Korean, and Tyler is quite the seasoned Korean student and quite good. You're a good example of how far Lango Korean can take you.
All thanks to you.
감사합니다. Okay, turning now to Chinese.
Specifically Mandarin. So the point I want to make in my slide here on Chinese syllable structure, the importance of the concept of the syllable for Chinese sounds is really, it's a central thing. So we're going to see some examples where you can have the same ingredients pronounced different, quite divergent ways, depending on if they're spread across two syllables or concentrated into one. In Mandarin, adjacent sounds sometimes influence each other. And by that, I mean if they're next to each other in a syllable primarily. Some types of, it can occur across syllables a little bit, maybe less important to learn, but within a syllable, we see huge differences. So we're going to be talking about some first tone words. First means high level sounding, involving the consonant C in the onset. That's a palatal fricative C. We have a glide or high vowel sound E there. Then we have our nucleus is the vowel a low vowel, and then the N sound at the end of the syllable. So those hyphens are showing what the position is within a word. So if we put all these ingredients, all these four segments plus the tone into one syllable, it will sound like this. Xian, such as the word for go first, to be the first one. Xian, we have it in xiansheng, meaning Mr., person who was born first. Now, the influence I was talking about within a syllable, when this low vowel a is between an e and an n, then it's going to raise a little bit to an e, the epsilon sound. Xian, we also see nasal influence in anticipation of the n coda. The velum is going to lower and the vowel will have nasal resonance on it. Xian. The next example, we can have these same underlying segments in two syllables sounding like this. Xi'an, which is a place name. It was one of the ancient capitals of China. So again, for contrast, xian, when these four sounds are together in one syllable, versus xi'an, spread across two.
Very interesting.
Yeah, that's a really good, these two are really good. This is something that took me as also a learner of Mandarin a while. But when you know these rules, it really, really helps you. Because when you just see it spelled out right in the pinyin, Xian, you want to say it this way, Xi'an, as in from an English perspective, I guess. But when you know these rules and you see that together in one syllable, yeah, Xian.
This example also shows the importance of this it's a little hard to see in this font, but you have the apostrophe put in. That's to show there's a syllable break here.
That's very useful.
And then it does the thing you said earlier, which is if something begins with a vowel, there'll be an inserted glottal stop. As in she and, is that okay? Is that right?
Xi'an.
Right.
Xi'an.
In syllable two, an. It's not preceded by a yut in the same syllable, so that brightening of the a vowel doesn't take place. It's just this basic an.
Now it sounds kind of like there's some downstepping in the tone. Is that?
Xian. No, I don't think there.
Not at all. All right.
I mean, I'm not a native speaker.
Xian.
You have a very careful ear, though, Tyler. So I was just curious to ask.
I like that you denoted the glottal stop there too. All right, very nice. But Pinyin does a really nice job. I think that's so useful right there to, indicate that too.
And before we go on, real quick, I just want to point out,
Yes.
for those of you who don't know Chinese characters, there's a nice rule.
Oh, yeah.
In Chinese, each character, so each written mark, always going to be one syllable in length. There is an exception for Mandarin, but this is a nice illustration of the basic principle. Xi'an, 2 syllables, is going to be 2 characters versus xian, single character.
That's very useful. Yeah, so many people are intimidated by Mandarin, especially writing Chinese characters. But speaking from the experience of a learner, it's become way less intimidating and really cool.
Once you learn your first 100 or so, right?
Yeah. Then it's no sweat.
And you can see the sort of influence, the graphic influence of Chinese onto Korean. They like this one syllable, one block principle, and imported it into Hangul, which was created specifically for Korean.
Yeah.
I also noticed I'd never heard the Chinese pronunciation of that syllable before for go first, but I recognized it from the Japanese word sen, as in sensei.
They borrowed many, many words from Chinese, as Korean did as well. Sen is actually closer to the Middle Chinese pronunciation, the way it was several centuries ago. Mandarin has added this medial glide, ye, xin. So it's really that the bright vowel inserted the glide rather than the glide raising the vowel, viewed historically, but we're talking about synchronic analysis.
But this is a really fascinating topic, is the, the comparisons between Chinese, Japanese, Korean. And we'll be digging into that in a future book, actually.
And we've also got one blog post, maybe a couple others on it, but the one by Levi is worth looking at. He talks about these correspondences.
Absolutely.
That's at the Lango blog, langoinstitute.com. Click under the things heading and you'll find our blog there.
And we have a bunch of students actually learning one of these or 2 of these, 3 of these, and it's very helpful to think about.
On to our next segment.
Hey. The ineffable.
So today we're going to talk about complex syllables. Now, we've been talking about it through the whole podcast. And if you've listened to our other podcasts, you know we always leave a challenge towards the end that's sometimes tangentially, but this time particularly related to our complex. So the rules of the game are, first of all, count sounds, not letters. That's just a general rule for language learning. Always pay attention to sounds more than letters if you're trying to speak and listen. And in this case, we're interested in sounds. We want to know what is the most sounds in a single syllable in English. If you know a non-English language and you want to submit some of those too, we are interested. And
Oh, yeah, that'd be cool too.
welcoming that. But English has pretty complex syllables. And if you are a native speaker, you can dive through your mental lexicon and see what you find. The most complex one we came up with was strengths. So if you have more than one strength, if you have multiple of them, you might have strengths. Now, pronounced that way, as I just did, I think you could argue there is 8 sounds.
Yeah, in
8
fast
sounds.
speech, it becomes reduced, as you as you might imagine. But strengths. Yeah, I agree with you.
I don't think I pronounced the th in writing, the theta in sounds. I think I just say strengths.
I do too. Strengths.
Strengths. Yeah, but a careful speaker, say if someone was really trying to learn this and I was teaching them English, I would probably carefully say strengths.
Maybe they were hearing the word strange or something and you wanted to emphasize, no, I don't mean strange, I mean strengths. You can take your time on it.
Yes, and there's always the remote possibility that strength becomes something else, like a type of boat, I imagine. And you were like, no, strengths. I don't know.
Not unimaginable with all these new words coming in.
Yeah, we're just making up new words, but that's the name of the game of human language. Let's have some new words, new sounds, change how we talk. That's how we do it.
The beauty of it.
So what we want to know is what's the biggest syllable you can make? Now, strengths is a renowned big syllable. It may be hard to beat. So if you can beat it, if you can find one with more than 8 sounds in careful speech, you gotta let us know. It's an emergency. But even if you can think of other ones with 7 or 6, it's going to be pretty hard and pretty impressive. So go ahead and let us know on Twitter, let us know on Instagram, email me. You can send a carrier pigeon. I want to know what is the most complex syllable you can think of in English. If you can think of complex syllables in other languages, I'm interested to know too. I think some languages like of the Pacific Northwest are going to have just massively complex syllables. I've heard it called extrasyllabic material because they're like, this can't all be part of one syllable. I think that if you speak, I'm not going to spoil it too much. I don't want to give you too many to look for, but there are languages which allow K to be a nucleus, so they allow stops as vowel, and these ones might have pretty complex consonants and codas too.
And
So
there might be Scandinavian languages that
Mhm.
allow more strings of consonants than English does, even. But,
that's right. I was thinking, Berber, Bella Kula, Klallam type stuff, but of course there's probably even some European ones that'll
Icelandic.
get pretty wild.
Mhm.
So we want to know what you think about complex syllables.
And I want to mention, it's probably in my outro, but we will do a live wordplay segment soon with Peter as the host. And this is the stuff we'll talk about. We also may have some hink pinks or hinkety pinks, some wordplay involved as well. So watch for that. It'll be live on our Instagram.
has a date been scheduled for that?
Not yet. So you got to watch this space sometime next month. That brings us to wordplay. Speaking of wordplay, topic we take so seriously. Today we're going to share a useful mnemonic that is in our second book in the
A little hard to see.
Lango Korean series. Yeah, it's hard with this background.
There we go.
To put it right here. Okay, this comes from our new book, Korean Pando, Korean Peninsula, spelled Punninsula, Zing. And this particular pun is a great mnemonic for learning the native Korean numbers. As we put it in the book, Korean is blessed to have 2 number systems.
Mhm.
One is Sino-Korean, based on Chinese numbers, and then one is native Korean. And I don't know which one you think is harder. What do you think? My husband thinks it's the native Korean system. What do you think?
I found it that way too as a beginning.
As a Chinese,
just
because
takes
you
a
know the
bit-
Chinese numbers.
That's
That
true.
helps you.
I agreed.
The
So,
in the Chinese system, they're all the same size. Each numeral is just a single syllable.
and then there's kind of a tone pattern system too to help you remember at least the tones.
Oh, when you're learning
In
Mandarin,
Mandarin.
that is that, right? That's not so relevant for Korean.
But yeah, if you do know the Chinese numbers, obviously the Sino-Korean system will be much easier, I think. In terms of the native Korean numbers, I don't know why, but 8, 9, 10 are always a bit harder, even 7 too. And this is a great mnemonic for learning those numbers. And this is hat tip from our Lango intern, Li Shi. All right, so our mnemonic here. So number 9 in Korean system is ahop, and number 10 is yol. So our mnemonic is I hope all 9 of y'all can count to 10. And in the book, illustrated by our talented illustrator, Farah, can you see it?
Hopping in and out of existence along with your face.
Uh-oh, all right. Well, you just got to buy the book to see the
Yeah.
beautiful illustrations then.
It's for sale on Amazon. Anywhere else you can get it? You can get it on the website.
You can contact us, or on Amazon, you can get it as the ebook or the printed book. And the print, I will say, is beautiful, so I encourage you to get it. On the front, you see it?
Mm-hmm.
We've got the Korean Pando, the Korean Peninsula, and it looks like someone's getting ready to go there by studying Korean, right? And so please check it out in person, in the print version or ebook. That brings us to Sasak.
What is
Okay.
Sasak?
What is it?
So let me tell you a little bit about Sasak and how we got
Yes,
this
please.
kind of idiom from Sasak. So Sasak is a language or a number of languages spoken on the island of Lombok in Indonesia. Now, you may not have heard of Lombok, but Lombok is across the Wallace line from Bali. So it's just east of Bali. I hear Lombok has excellent surfing. I don't know how to surf, but if you're a surfer, you might want to check it out.
I've been to Bali, and I can attest to the beauty of the
Mm.
beaches there. And I don't surf, but I saw a lot of surfers out there, and I watched them.
It does look like a good spot for it. I have a good friend who's a native speaker of Sasak, a variety of Sasak. There are several varieties. And just from my brief experience studying Sasak, it appears that many people can understand each other because they have a lot of words that are the same, but that the grammars of the different varieties are really, really different. And it's very exciting if you're a linguist. There's a lot of good work coming out. Contact us if you want references. So my good friend and professional linguist, native speaker of Sasak, told me a little kind of idiom in Sasak, which is angit angit tayan manok, right? And it means angit angit is a reduplication of warm, right? And tai is the word for feces in most Austronesian languages. The suffix there, you might not know tayan is a suffixed word, but it is, and that's the third singular possessive form. And then manok is chicken. You might remember manok from it's cognate with the Hawaiian word manu, right? So that's a very common Austronesian word, originally manok, meaning chicken, and became to mean bird out in Polynesia under Manu when they lost the coda because Oceanic languages didn't like codas. So what it means is it's used to describe a situation or person who is very excited or on fire to do something but quickly loses passion. Kind of like, someone who may be really, really interested. I have seen this a million times myself, not just in language learning, but in all sorts of things. Particularly, I noticed it. I also train jujitsu, and there are many people who come and love it at first, but
burn out quickly.
You just have to love getting smashed for every single day for years. That's all there is to it. It's the whole sport. So people lose their fire for it. And my good friend Nisa told us this little idiom, and I quite like it. Angit, angit, tayan monok. So if you have some idioms or jokes or riddles in a language you think we haven't mentioned, or a language we have mentioned, but you just have one, you should let us know. We might shout you out too. I really enjoyed this one from Nisa, and as someone in love with Austronesian languages, if you know one in an Austronesian language, definitely let me know, even if it doesn't make the podcast. I want to know.
Can I ask real quick about the structure of this one? Is this part the subject, the chicken poop?
Okay, so
reduplicated. Oh, yeah.
And is it the predicate out in front?
I kind of think the whole thing is a noun phrase. So I should have asked the structure from Nisa. I'd need to hear it in a sentence to know. I wrote a paper about this variety's syntax, but I focused entirely on the voice alternations. So I do know how verbs work, but one of the problems here is the same kind of things you can get on verbs, you can get on nouns when it comes to disagreement, the third singular. So that's really a genitive suffix.
Right.
So I think that thing is indicating, I'd have to ask Nisa.
Right.
But I believe that is actually referencing the thing you're talking about, the person or the situation that was on fire but isn't anymore. Although it could be also the chickens possessing of their own poop.
Their own more poop.
Because essentially this thing out loud is like, it's referring, so this is a bit crass, but this is the way life is. If you grew up with chickens, then you know. I'm from the country, and I know. But the chicken's poop will be very warm at first, but quickly cool off. So if you step in it, you'll know firsthand. If you ever spend time in a village in flip-flops, which I've spent quite a bit myself, then you'll learn this lesson firsthand as well. So that's why it's kind of funny. You have to know about chickens to know why it's.
So cultural
if you relate,
lesson there
it's
too.
hilarious. Yeah. It's hilarious.
I think it's funny. All right, outro time. Couple announcements before we wrap up. And if you made it this far, then you are a true Langaroo. Right. This is an important announcement. This LanGoPod is, after the 3rd episode, we are now going to syndicate on YouTube and on iTunes. So please follow us in both places. You can also read more about podcast topics on our blog. I thought the last one was really great. Had a couple examples from English as well as from Portuguese. Any more to say on that? Those will be written by Peter and just a snippet from some of the more interesting aspects of this podcast. All right, our fall 2 sessions coming up, October 12th or 19th. We're offering a little bit earlier start so we don't go too much into the holiday season. And these will be on-site, online, and blended classes.
And
We
you
also, yeah,
what
Tyler?
you want to mention what all languages we're offering?
Yes, let's do it. We now offer a bunch of languages. We have Korean taught by me, Tyler.
Chinese, Japanese, German, French, English.
Peter is teaching Portuguese. We have Luis teaching Italian and Spanish, and Marison teaching Spanish as well. So we offer quite a list of languages now. Please let us know if you're interested. We're running an early bird promo through October 11th. So you still have time to save 10% off of all language programs. We also have conversation hours going on. These will be entirely online and a variety of topics. Right now we're doing these really fun ones on table topics that extend out into a lot of good conversation. Linguistics for language learning workshops. We just did one. I want to talk a little bit about that, the English pronunciation skills workshop. It was taught by Tyler and Peter.
So what we've done so far is introduce IPA, the consonant and vowel symbols for learners so that they can effectively use dictionaries, online or print, to learn how to pronounce words that they haven't heard yet.
I thought it went so well. By the end, the students were transcribing in IPA, doing really well.
Another thing that's coming up that I forgot to mention we're teaching Chinese characters, Hanja, specifically geared for learners of Korean.
That's coming up shortly as well. A lot of exciting things going on. And if you have any questions, comments, please contact Peter. You can contact all of us, but Peter is the main, so get at him. Or DM us, add us on social.
That's right.
Institute. That's it, right? Same for Twitter and everywhere else?
Our name's the same across our platforms. So no matter what you use for social, you can get a hold of us. And thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time, episode 4.
Yes, thank you all. Ciao.
안녕히 계세요. 再见.